Money has always been a silent pact. An agreement that needs no words, but that sustains entire societies. From the first markets in primitive villages to the stock exchanges of the 21st century, humanity has relied on symbols that, in and of themselves, have no value. At first, those symbols were grains of cereal, heads of cattle, pieces of shiny metal. They were tangible, palpable things that could be used, eaten, or melted. They were wealth in themselves. But at some point in history, we took a leap of faith. We decided that a piece of paper, with ink and numbers printed on it, could be worth the same as gold, silver, or wheat. That leap forever changed the way we live, trade, and dream. Paper became the great spell of modernity, a banknote that does not feed, that does not shelter, that cannot be forged into a sword or turned into bread. And yet, we protect it, hoard it, venerate it as if it were the very blood of life. But paper has a hidden fragility. It's a mirror that reflects only collective trust. When that trust is broken, paper money turns to ash in your hands. And what seemed like wealth suddenly becomes a reminder of what was lost. History is full of these silent collapses. China, the pioneer of paper money, discovered that printing banknotes without control meant opening the door to ruin. Rome, which did not know the banknote but did know devaluation, taught the world that tampering with currency meant sowing distrust and rebellion. Medieval Europe saw bankers and kings attempt to create wealth out of thin air, only to end up plunged into bankruptcies that swept away entire villages. And in modern times, Germany in the 1920s, Venezuela in the last decade, Zimbabwe and Argentina in their recurring crises, remind us that the fragility of paper remains intact. Because the inconvenient truth is that paper money was never solid. It was always a promise, sustained by the faith of millions of people who believed in the word of a state, in the power of a central bank, or in the stability of a nation. When that faith fades, paper turns to smoke, and empires crumble. This journey you're about to hear isn't just about money or the economy. It's a journey through the fragility of civilization itself, because every bill tells a story. The story of trust, of ambition, and the inevitable fall of those who believe they can print unlimited wealth. Today, as you hold a bill in your hands, remember that you are not touching money itself. You're holding a promise that can be kept, or that can fall apart overnight. And now, let's travel back to the beginning together, where it all began, when humanity did not yet know what it was like to trust a piece of paper, and value was measured in grain, in metal, in sweat, and in blood. Chapter 1. From Barter to Metallic Currency. At the dawn of civilization, humans had no coins, bills, or bank accounts. Exchanges took place face to face, in the silence of primitive markets or in the privacy of villages. A farmer would give wheat, and in return would receive oil or cattle. A craftsman offered tools, and received textiles or salt. The system was simple in appearance, but it hid a deep problem: the difficulty of finding fair equivalences. How much wheat is a goat worth? How many pieces of cloth must be handed over for a clay pot? Barter, although natural, was doomed to run up against its own limits. Over time, humanity discovered that it needed a common pattern, something that everyone could accept without long discussions. The first attempts were rudimentary: grains of cereal measured in jars, blocks of salt, even shiny seashells that served as symbols of wealth. But it soon became clear that a more durable material was needed, one that could withstand the test of time and the wear and tear of the markets. It was then that brass instruments began to take center stage. In ancient Lydia, a region of Asia Minor around the 7th century BC, a step was taken that would change human trade forever. The first metal coins minted with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, appeared there. These pieces carried an official seal, a mark that guaranteed their authenticity and value. Metal became more than just shiny material. It became a symbol of trust. There was no longer any need to argue in every exchange. A gold or silver coin spoke for itself. The power of gold and silver lay in the fact that they were not mere symbols. They were goods with intrinsic value, desired for their rarity, beauty, and resistance to the corruption of time. Gold doesn't rust, doesn't rot, doesn't fade with the seasons. And so, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Greece to Rome, became the basis of wealth. Metal coins circulated from one end of the ancient world to the other, building a universal language that everyone understood, the tangible value of precious metal. Unlike barter, coins could be accumulated without risk of spoilage. The grain rotted, the salt dissolved, the animals died, but the gold remained intact. That eternal character made it the perfect backing for trust. To have gold was to have power. Having money meant having security. And having coins meant being able to participate in a system that united entire cultures under a single symbol of value. Thus, trade flourished. Markets expanded, caravan routes multiplied, and Mediterranean ports filled with valuable coins that passed from hand to hand. The sound of metal striking metal became the music of prosperity. A language without words, but full of meaning. Metallic money not only facilitated trade, it also built trust between strangers. But, like every human creation, the system brought with it a new form of inequality. Those who could accumulate precious metals became power elites, while the rest were relegated to surviving on the bare minimum. The metallic currency was fair in appearance, but in practice it consolidated hierarchies. A handful of gold could buy land, armies, even wills. Thus, metal was not only an economic instrument, but also a political one. Temples and palaces soon became custodians of this treasure. The physical backing of gold and silver served as a guarantee of collective trust, but it also concentrated power in the hands of a few. In this way, the precious metal became more than just wealth. It was the foundation of empires, the bedrock upon which entire civilizations were built. However, the seed of fragility had already been planted. The gold was solid, yes. The money was real, yes. But human ambition would soon discover that the temptation to multiply money without limit would be too strong. And so, centuries later, someone would imagine that it was not necessary to have metal to back up trust. It would be enough to have paper. Chapter 2. The Leap to Paper. 7th century China. In the vast geography of ancient China, a seemingly eternal empire that stretched like an ocean of cultures and languages under a single banner, an idea was born that would forever transform the history of money. Until then, gold, silver, and copper were the main sources of wealth. Heavy metal coins circulated along trade routes linking distant cities, and silk caravans crossed mountains and deserts, carrying hundreds of coins in their sacks that clinked like a metallic choir. Trade was brisk, but also suffering from the literal burden of metal. Transporting large sums of money involved escorts, pack animals, the risk of bandits, and inevitable losses. And in that context, the pragmatic mind of the Chinese was ahead of the rest of the world. It was during the Tang Dynasty, around the 7th century, that the first experiments with metal substitutes began to appear. Powerful merchants, unable to transport large quantities of copper and iron on their voyages, devised an ingenious system. Certificates of deposit representing a certain amount of coins stored in trust houses. These papers were not yet money in themselves, but they functioned as promises of payment. They were lighter, more practical, and easier to carry on long journeys. What was initially a private resource among merchants soon attracted the attention of the state. Over time, the Song dynasty institutionalized this system and transformed it into official policy. Paper ceased to be a mere private receipt and became a currency backed by imperial authority. Banknotes were printed bearing solemn inscriptions, red seals, warnings against counterfeiters, and the promise that they could be exchanged for copper coins at any time. It was the birth of paper money, a silent revolution, an innovation that seemed almost magical. Suddenly, money was no longer metal, but a thin sheet of plant fibers that fit into the sleeve of a tunic. The practical benefit was undeniable. Where copper chests were once needed, now a few sheets were enough. Where once a caravan might move slowly because of the weight of the money it carried, now the merchants moved lightly, swift as the wind. Trade flourished further, routes multiplied, and Song China became an unprecedented economic center. The seemingly fragile paper rose as a symbol of power and confidence. But within that fragility lay an invisible risk. Gold and silver were limited. They had to be mined. They had to be traded. They had to be worked. Paper, on the other hand, could be multiplied with just a gesture. The ink on the fiber, the scribe's hand, the seal of authority. That ease turned into temptation. If printing more was so easy, why limit yourself to what's necessary? State power discovered that paper could finance wars, build colossal projects, cover deficits without waiting for more metals to enter the coffers. Thus began the first great lesson of inflation. In its early days, paper was valuable because it was backed by copper. But little by little, the excess issuance made the redemption promises increasingly difficult to fulfill. The bills multiplied, but the amount of metal did not grow at the same rate. Trust, that delicate invisible thread that holds every monetary system together, began to fray. People began to suspect, to distrust, to demand that promises be kept. And when promises aren't kept, the money turns into worthless paper. The history of Song China is a warning mirror. It showed the world the power and fragility of paper money, the strength it could give to commerce, but also the abyss that opened up when the state gave in to the temptation of printing more than it should. That collapse wasn't immediate. It stretched over decades, but it left an indelible mark on humanity's economic memory. The paper could be money, yes, but its value lay not in the ink or the fiber. Their value was in their trust. And that trust, as Rome, medieval Europe, and even modern empires would discover centuries later, was the most fragile of all riches. Chapter 3. Devaluations in Rome and the Middle Ages. At the dawn of the Roman Empire, the denarius was more than just a coin. It was the symbol of Rome's strength, the metallic testament to a power that extended across the Mediterranean. A small, polished, uniform piece of silver, circulated among soldiers, merchants, and citizens. The denarius had intrinsic value. It contained real silver, extracted from mines controlled by Rome through its conquests. It was accepted in distant markets, respected in international transactions, and represented the promise of stability for an empire that seemed eternal. But as the centuries passed, that fortress began to crumble. The emperors, faced with increasingly costly wars, discovered a dangerous trap. Silver was limited, but the demands of armies were infinite. More soldiers, more weapons, more conquests. And so, what began as a slight reduction in the metal content of each coin eventually became systematic adulteration. The once proudly silver denarius began to lose its shine, to dull, to become a false reflection of itself. The adulteration was simple. The amount of silver was reduced and mixed with less valuable metals, such as copper or tin. At first, the difference was almost imperceptible. The people trusted the emperor's image minted on the coin, without pausing to examine its purity. But nature is unforgiving, and soon the real value began to diverge from the nominal value. Merchants demanded more coins for the same merchandise. Soldiers demanded higher pay. And inflation, the shadow that accompanies every devaluation, began to spread throughout the empire. What Rome discovered, perhaps without wanting to accept it, is that trust is harder to govern than legions. An army can subdue a city, but a weakened currency subdues an empire itself. The adulteration of the denarius was a desperate recourse, a hidden tax, a way to steal value from the people without openly declaring it. And that practice, which seemed clever in the short term, sowed the seeds of distrust. The Middle Ages inherited this lesson, but did not fully learn it. In European markets, centuries after the fall of Rome, metal currency remained the basis of the economy. However, human ingenuity found new ways to reduce its value. The practice of clipping became common. Gold and silver coins were filed down along their edges, stealing a bit of metal with each transaction. Thousands of small reductions, invisible to the untrained eye, ultimately disrupted the purity of the monetary system. Kings also played their part in this story. Like the Roman emperors, many medieval rulers were tempted to issue coins with less precious metal, trusting that the people's faith in their authority would be enough to keep them in circulation. But people aren't blind. When currency starts to lose weight, when its shine fades, when exchange rates are no longer fair, trust is broken. And it is this rupture, invisible but devastating, that marked many of the economic crises of the Middle Ages. Merchants began demanding payment in pure metal. Cities strengthened their own mints, and in some cases, transactions reverted to barter. Not because barter was more efficient, but because money had lost its soul. Trust. Thus, from Rome to the Middle Ages, humanity learned that metal currency, although seemingly solid, was not free from corruption. That rulers, in their ambition to sustain wars and projects of power, could destroy the value of that which sustained their entire society. And that distrust, that silent poison, was capable of bringing down entire systems, long before an enemy army. Chapter 4: Europe and the First Paper Disasters. When the idea of paper money, born centuries earlier in China, began to travel to the West, it did so wrapped in promises of modernity, efficiency, and progress. Europe, in the midst of its commercial and financial awakening, saw in those fragile printed sheets a tool to expand its markets without relying on the heavy metal. But what seemed like a brilliant innovation soon revealed its shadows. Paper, while freeing merchants from the burden of gold and silver, opened the door to an even more serious problem: the illusion of infinite wealth. One of the first European experiments occurred in Sweden. In the mid-17th century, the Stockholm Bank issued banknotes backed by metal deposits. Initially, confidence was high. The banknotes were easier to use than the huge, heavy Swedish copper coins, which sometimes weighed several kilos. Paper seemed like a gift of progress, a bridge to smoother commerce. But soon, the bank issued more banknotes than it could support. Paper holders rushed to redeem their debts for metal, and when the treasury couldn't deliver, trust crumbled like a sandcastle. The Swedish example was only a prelude to what was to come later in France. There appeared the figure of John Law, a Scotsman with a brilliant mind and overflowing charisma, who convinced the French monarchy that paper could be the key to prosperity. At the beginning of the 18th century, Law founded the General Bank and later the Royal Bank, obtaining the power to issue banknotes convertible into specie. But his ambition didn't stop there. He also launched the Mississippi Company, which promised vast riches through French colonies in America. The result was one of the first financial bubbles in history. People, seduced by the promise of easy wealth, rushed to buy the company's shares. Prices soared, fueled by the constant issuance of paper money and official propaganda. The streets of Paris were filled with rumors, novice speculators, and aristocrats desperate not to be left out of the feast. The illusion was so powerful that many sold their possessions, mortgaged lands and estates, and believed that the Mississippi would return their fortunes multiplied. But the promised wealth didn't exist, was smoke held together by paper. When people tried to exchange their banknotes and shares for metal, the machinery collapsed. Stock prices plummeted, confidence in banknotes plummeted, and France plunged into a devastating crisis. What had been hope turned into ruin. Thousands of families were left in poverty. Credit evaporated, and John Law's name was branded as a symbol of deceit and profiteering. These early failed attempts left a clear lesson. Paper money could be a driving force of growth and confidence, but also a chasm when the temptation to print overcame prudence. Europe discovered that paper alone does not create wealth. That the magic of transforming fibers into money depended on something much more fragile: the people's faith that those promises would be honored. And so, in Sweden and France, paper money showed its double face for the first time, that of progress and that of catastrophe. Humanity had opened Pandora's box of non-metallic money, and what would come out of it would be a succession of illusions and collapses that would mark the financial history of the centuries to come. The failure of the first paper issues not only hit the economy hard, it also left scars on Europe's collective memory. For decades, the mere mention of banknotes evoked distrust, as if those sheets of paper carried deceit rather than wealth. Peasants preferred heavy coins in their hands. Merchants demanded silver and gold in important exchanges, and financial elites understood that trust was a far more valuable resource than any ingot hidden in vaults. However, history has shown that neither Sweden nor France were simply failures, but necessary trials. The ruin had shown the dangers of excess, but it had also revealed the power of paper as an instrument of transformation. Behind every collapse remained an unanswered question. Would it be possible to find a balance between illusion and reality, between the printed promise and the tangible value? That doubt, like a persistent echo, would accompany European governments for centuries. Thus, the early paper disasters did not close the path, but opened it to new attempts. Nations learned that money wasn't just metal or paper, but a shared fiction, a collective faith that could vanish in an instant. Europe had discovered that true value lay not in buried gold or printed ink, but in the invisible trust that sustained the entire financial edifice. And that lesson, written with pain and hope, would set the course for centuries to come. Chapter 5: Weimar Germany, the worthless banknote. After World War I, Germany had not only lost territory and pride, but had also inherited an unpayable debt. The Treaty of Versailles imposed enormous economic reparations, equivalent to hundreds of billions in gold, an unbearable burden for a defeated country. The German state, short of resources, found an apparent solution: printing money. Thus, more and more Reichsmark notes began to circulate, at first as a respite, then like a snowball that no one could stop. What initially seemed like a pragmatic solution soon turned into a catastrophe. Prices rose day after day. Wages became outdated in a matter of hours, and everyday life became absurd. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks in the morning, and by evening it was worth twice that much. Entire families carried bundles of banknotes in wheelbarrows just to buy basic foodstuffs, and in some cases, paper money was more useful as fuel for lighting a stove than as a means of payment. Hyperinflation wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a psychological wound in the nation. The savings of entire generations disappeared overnight. The middle class was pushed into poverty, and trust in institutions was shattered. People stopped believing in the money printed by their own government. And that loss of faith became a social and political fracture that would forever mark German history. The lesson of Weimar was brutal. When trust in money fades, the entire social structure falters. The Reichsmark had lost its value not because it lacked ink or paper, but because the people stopped believing in it. The economy became a wasteland where transactions were impossible, and the chaos opened the door to collective despair. That emptiness, that feeling that nothing was solid, was the breeding ground for the radicalisms that would come later. Thus, the memory of Germany was marked. A country where money had lost all meaning, where banknotes piled up like useless mountains, and where society understood that the most fragile wealth is that which depends on faith in a piece of paper. Weimar became the perfect example of what happens when the monetary illusion is broken. A timeless reminder that money is only as strong or as weak as the trust that sustains it. The impact on daily life was devastating. A worker could collect his wages in the morning, immediately run to the store, and still discover that prices had gone up before he arrived. Housewives traded goods with neighbors, because money was no longer reliable. The farmers, incredulous, preferred to let their crops rot rather than sell them for banknotes that would be worthless tomorrow. The economy became a tragicomedy, where the symbols of progress, newly printed banknotes, were, in fact, signs of collapse. Amidst this chaos, the images were surreal. Children playing at building castles with stacks of banknotes, as if they were toy blocks. Men lighting cigars with 100-mark notes, because tobacco was more valuable than money. Women pushing wheelbarrows full of paper to buy a single egg or a piece of butter. The absurd became commonplace. And with it grew the feeling that all logic had evaporated from society. But the real poison wasn't inflation, but the loss of faith. Confidence in the state, in banks, in the future, crumbled at the same rate as prices rose. The middle class, until then the mainstay of the social order, saw its life savings disintegrate. Suddenly, those who had worked for decades were like beggars. Inequality turned into rage, and rage became fertile ground for leaders who promised order at any price. The echoes of Weimar resonate to this day. It was the starkest demonstration that money is not a metal, nor a piece of paper, but a collective agreement, a shared belief. When that belief is broken, all the banknotes in the world are not enough to sustain an empire. The Reichsmark remained a symbol of monetary absurdity, reminding us that wealth can disappear silently, simply because we stop believing in it. Chapter 5: Weimar Germany, the worthless banknote. After World War I, Germany had not only lost territory and pride, but had also inherited an unpayable debt. The Treaty of Versailles imposed enormous economic reparations, equivalent to hundreds of billions in gold, an unbearable burden for a defeated country. The German state, short of resources, found an apparent solution: printing money. Thus, more and more Reichsmark notes began to circulate, at first as a respite, then like a snowball that no one could stop. What initially seemed like a pragmatic solution soon turned into a catastrophe. Prices rose day after day. Wages became outdated in a matter of hours, and everyday life became absurd. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks in the morning, and by evening it was worth twice that much. Entire families carried bundles of banknotes in wheelbarrows just to buy basic foodstuffs, and in some cases, paper money was more useful as fuel for lighting a stove than as a means of payment. Hyperinflation wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a psychological wound in the nation. The savings of entire generations disappeared overnight. The middle class was pushed into poverty, and trust in institutions was shattered. People stopped believing in the money printed by their own government. And that loss of faith became a social and political fracture that would forever mark German history. The lesson of Weimar was brutal. When trust in money fades, the entire social structure falters. The Reichsmark had lost its value not because it lacked ink or paper, but because the people stopped believing in it. The economy became a wasteland where transactions were impossible, and the chaos opened the door to collective despair. That emptiness, that feeling that nothing was solid, was the breeding ground for the radicalisms that would come later. Thus, the memory of Germany was marked. A country where money had lost all meaning, where banknotes piled up like useless mountains, and where society understood that the most fragile wealth is that which depends on faith in a piece of paper. Weimar became the perfect example of what happens when the monetary illusion is broken, a timeless reminder that money is only as strong or as weak as the trust that sustains it. The impact on daily life was devastating. A worker could collect his wages in the morning, immediately run to the store, and still discover that prices had gone up before he arrived. Housewives traded goods with neighbors, because money was no longer reliable. The farmers, incredulous, preferred to let their crops rot rather than sell them for banknotes that would be worthless tomorrow. The economy became a tragicomedy, where the symbols of progress, newly printed banknotes, were, in fact, signs of collapse. Amidst this chaos, the images were surreal. Children playing at building castles with stacks of banknotes, as if they were toy blocks. Men lighting cigars with 100-mark notes, because tobacco was more valuable than money. Women pushing wheelbarrows full of paper to buy a single egg or a piece of butter. The absurd became commonplace. And with it grew the feeling that all logic had evaporated from society. But the real poison wasn't inflation, but the loss of faith. Confidence in the state, in banks, in the future, crumbled at the same rate as prices rose. The middle class, until then the mainstay of the social order, saw its life savings disintegrate. Suddenly, those who had worked for decades were like beggars. Inequality turned into rage, and rage became fertile ground for leaders who promised order at any price. The echoes of Weimar resonate to this day. It was the starkest demonstration that money is not a metal, nor a piece of paper, but a collective agreement, a shared belief. When that belief is broken, all the banknotes in the world are not enough to sustain an empire. The Reichsmark remained a symbol of monetary absurdity, reminding us that wealth can disappear silently, simply because we stop believing in it. Chapter 6: Modern Collapses. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Argentina. History tells us that currency collapses are not relics of the past, but rather wounds that remain open in the present. The ruins of Weimar seemed like a distant memory, an example from another century. But in reality, the fragility of paper money continues to haunt nations. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina are living testimony to how the same mistakes are repeated under different names, different flags, and different faces in power. All of them trapped in the same cycle, printing unbacked money, spending more than they produce, and watching faith in the currency dissolve and disappear. In Venezuela, oil promised to be the eternal source of wealth. For decades, oil revenues sustained subsidies, social programs, and a model of artificial abundance. But when the price of crude oil fell, the machine stopped. The government, unable to sustain its expenses, turned to the printing press. Bolivar bills circulated in immeasurable quantities, until the zeros became infinite. A cup of coffee once cost millions, and money lost its meaning. The irony was brutal. A country rich in oil, but with a population unable to buy basic foodstuffs. Zimbabwe offers an even more extreme picture. In the first decade of the 21st century, inflation reached such absurd levels that 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar bills were printed. A piece of paper that in theory represented a fortune, but in practice couldn't even pay for a loaf of bread. Images spread around the world. People carrying bags full of bills to buy the bare minimum. Children playing with bills as if they were confetti. Money lost its role as a measure of value, and with it, the social fabric collapsed. Argentina, for its part, represents the cyclical version of this tragedy. It's not a sudden collapse like Weimar or Zimbabwe, but an endless repetition of inflation, devaluations, and crises. Every decade, the same story. Governments spending more than they earn, printing unbacked money, and a currency that slowly loses confidence. The Argentine peso has suffered so many devaluations and name changes that the population has learned to live without trusting their own money. Dollars hidden in mattresses, informal bartering, foreign accounts. The shadow economy became the only way to survive. What unites these countries is the same curse: unbacked money. The illusion that printing more banknotes can replace real production. But behind that illusion always comes the same result: millions turned into nothing. A lifetime's savings reduced to dust. The salary that seemed sufficient in the morning turned into misery by nightfall. Currency ceases to be a symbol of trust and becomes a constant reminder of the betrayal of governments toward their people. Suffering is not measured only in numbers. It is measured in empty stomachs, in families that cannot eat meat for months, in hospitals without medicine because money no longer buys what it should. Politics is poisoned, discourses are polarized, and people are looking for culprits: bankers, foreigners, minorities. In this broth of frustration, there is always the risk of authoritarian leaders promising easy solutions, reinforcing the cycle of misery. The most disturbing thing is that, although the examples are familiar, the world keeps repeating them. Every modern collapse is a warning mirror, a voice saying, there is no real wealth on paper if confidence and production abandon it. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina aren't anomalies. They're reminders of how fragile any currency can be, even those that seem strong today. The lesson remains the same from Mesopotamia. Money is nothing more than a promise, and when that promise is broken, the whole social edifice crumbles. In Caracas, scenes that seemed straight out of a cruel farce became common. People paying for a kilo of rice with bags full of bills, or leaving tips on tables that exceeded the actual cost of the meal by thousands. The bill became a physical encumbrance, heavy, bulky, useless. In some cases, merchants were more willing to accept dollars or even packages of flour as currency. The economy unwittingly reverted to a mix of barter and refuge in foreign currencies. In Zimbabwe, the absurdity reached historic levels. 100 trillion banknotes were so common that people used them as souvenirs or ornaments. Tourists bought worthless wads of cash for a couple of dollars, while locals wondered how they had gotten so humiliated. A man recounted how he had to carry several backpacks full of bills to pay for his daily transportation. Money, that symbol of power, had become a physical burden, a bitter joke against his own people. In Argentina, the crisis has become part of our identity. Each generation learned to distrust its own currency, to hoard dollars like water in times of drought. The peso lost value with each new government, and devaluations were so predictable that families adjusted their lives accordingly. A grandfather might tell his grandson that he had experienced 3, 4, or 5 currency exchanges in his lifetime. What should have been an instrument of stability, in Argentina, has become a constant reminder of instability. Chapter 7. The Future of Money. Money, that human invention that began as barter, that transformed into shiny metal, and then became fragile paper, today seems to be entering a new era. The question is no longer just how to pay, but what value really means in a digitalized world. Cryptocurrencies emerged as a rebellion, a promise of freedom from state control. Bitcoin, born in 2009 after the global financial crisis, was presented as people's money, independent of banks and governments. A code instead of a central bank, a decentralized network instead of institutions. For the first time in centuries, the power to issue money seemed to be escaping the hands of states. However, that freedom came with volatility. The value of a Bitcoin could double or halve in a matter of days. The promise of easy wealth attracted millions, but also sowed disappointment in those who arrived late. Some see it as digital gold, a store of value against inflation. Others consider it a bubble, a mirage that could vanish like so many bubbles of the past. The truth is that beyond its price, Bitcoin opened an irreverent debate. What if money doesn't need a state to exist? Faced with this threat, central banks responded with their own weapons. Today, multiple countries are experimenting with central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, electronic money issued and controlled directly by governments. China is moving forward with the digital yuan. Europe is debating the digital euro, and the United States is studying its own version. The official narrative is about efficiency, speed, and financial inclusion. But the other side is disturbing. A system where every transaction can be monitored, every movement recorded, every economic act subject to control. State-run digital money could mean the end of economic privacy. Amidst this tension, some evoke a return to the past, a return to gold. For centuries, gold has been the ultimate guarantee of trust. It is not dependent on governments, is not overprinted, and its rarity gives it near eternal value. When banknotes collapse, people rush to gold. When systems collapse, gold remains. Some economists see it as a necessary anchor in the era of paper and digital. Others consider it an anachronism, a chain that would impede the flexibility of modern economies. Are we then doomed to repeat the paper cycle in a new form? If governments print unlimited cryptocurrencies, or if they manipulate state digital currencies, The same poison of inflation could reappear in a different guise. Risk is not the form of money, but the eternal temptation to abuse it. Whether it's metal, paper, or digital code, the problem always comes back to the same: trust. This dilemma opens up a deeper reflection. Do we want state-controlled money, capable of monitoring citizens' every economic step? Or do we prefer a decentralized currency, free, but exposed to speculation and chaos? The tension between control and freedom defines the debate about the future of money today. There are risks at both extremes. At both extremes, the possibility of abuse. Perhaps the question isn't which form of money will prevail, but whether it's possible to build a truly robust system. One that doesn't depend on the whims of rulers, or the irrational euphoria of the markets. Money that isn't destroyed by inflation, that isn't manipulated by algorithms, that isn't wasted by abuse. Perhaps more than a new currency. What the world needs is a new pact of trust, an agreement that reminds us that money, in the end, is not gold, nor paper, nor code, but the faith we decide to place in it. Reflections on the value and fragility of money. Money has been a shadow that has followed human history. From the first stones exchanged silently, to the complex cryptocurrencies that travel invisibly across the network, their essence has always been the same: trust. But that trust is fragile. Rome forgot this when it adulterated its denarius. China learned this from the temptation to print more paper than necessary. Weimar suffered with banknotes that couldn't buy bread. Venezuela and Zimbabwe cried out in the desperation of millions reduced to nothing. Money is never stronger than the faith that sustains it. The history of money is also the history of human ambition. Kings, emperors, bankers, governments, all have been tempted to create wealth out of thin air. From cutting coins, from diluting metals, from printing banknotes, from turning on printing presses that work day and night. And always, sooner or later, the same consequence: inflation, collapse, ruin. Money, in all its forms, carries a silent warning. To abuse it is to invite disaster. Today, we believe we live in a more sophisticated age. We're talking about cryptocurrencies, central bank-issued digital currencies, and interconnected global economies. But beneath the sheen of modernity lies the same old dilemma. Who controls the money? Who decides how much the stuff in our pockets or on our phones is worth? The technological promise does not eliminate human risk, greed, politics, manipulation. We can change shape, but the cycle threatens to repeat itself. The central dilemma of money is not technical, but moral. Can a society resist the temptation to create wealth without the work behind it? Can a people sustain a system based on trust, when their leaders betray that trust time and again? It's not just about bills and coins. It's about the invisible pact that unites us as a community. When that pact is broken, no printing press can repair it. Perhaps the great lesson of this long story is not economic, but spiritual. Money isn't gold, paper, or code. It's a reflection of what we believe and what we fear. Its power comes from the human mind, from our ability to trust in a symbol, from a shared promise. And when we forget that, when we confuse wealth with printed or digital figures, that's when money betrays us. But maybe it's not money that betrays us, but ourselves. Because true value is not in bills or bank accounts, but in human work. in the effort, in the time we offer and share. Money should only be a bridge, not the ultimate goal. A bridge for exchange, for collaboration, for growing together. When we forget that, money becomes an idol, a prison, an illusion that consumes man himself. And yet, we continue to search for sound money, one that doesn't wear out, one that will withstand the storms of history. We may never find it in metals, or in paper, or in algorithms. Perhaps we need to look for it in something deeper, in ethics, in transparency, in shared responsibility. Truly sound money cannot be built without strong societies, without communities that choose to respect its value. And that's the final thought. The future of money doesn't depend on the form it takes, but on our awareness of it. Money has been born, grown, and collapsed time and again. The cycle can be repeated, but it can also be broken if we learn. What's at stake is not just the economy, but trust, justice, and the hope for a common future. As long as humanity exists, there will be money. The question that remains is another. Is there money that truly deserves our faith?